Mists of Pandaria Classic is on the horizon, and with Dragonsoul being out for quite some time now, I thought it would be a good opportunity to do a Cataclysm Classic retrospective. What's going on, guys? Entice here. Now, it is worth mentioning that throughout this video, I will be referencing and using data from ironforge.pro. This is to determine the health of the game at that particular time, and I know there will be people barking that this isn't a true representation of the player base, as many people have ults and they raid on, multiple characters, and it can skew the data. But at the end of the day, this is all we have, and in my opinion, this is a good enough indicator and only the data that is readily available. So with that said, let's get into the video. It's November 2023, and guilds have either killed Lich King or they're progging their way through Ice Crown Citadel. Now, while players know Ruby Sanctum is on the horizon, they wonder what's next in the classic timeline. Well, they wouldn't have to wait too long, because at BlizzCon, Blizzard announced that players will be able to take on Deathwing in Cataclysm Classic. So the scene was set. Cataclysm Classic was due to launch in May of 2024, but before that, the players would go into the Ruby Sanctum and take on Hellion. And after this was when things would start to heat up for Cataclysm Classic. Despite Blizzard making note that they had listened to the player base and had reached out to them via surveys before committing to the Cataclysm Classic expansion, this did not stop a rather vocal part of the community who, despite probably having no interest in playing Cataclysm, still felt the need to mention that the expansion would be, and I quote, dead on arrival. Now, this type of discourse began to ramp up as we got closer to the pre-patch, with some creators attempting to get some of those sweet clicks. An example of this comes from a long-time WoW YouTuber Nixium, who felt the need to misrepresent the announcement of Cataclysm Classic in his video titled "Why Nobody is Excited for Cataclysm Classic." Now, in this video, and I'm not sure why he does this, and I would assume it's because of clicks, because at the time everyone was just wanted clicks, and they still do to this point, and that's why it's very popular to kind of be heavily and sometimes overly negative towards Blizzard and WoW in general. But in this particular video, he kind of misrepresents the announcement of Cataclysm Classic, as if to say that it was literally no one in the room at BlizzCon was excited about it. But anyways, let's take a look at the clip.
You know, at BlizzCon 2023, you could have heard a freaking pin drop in the room when Cataclysm Classic was announced.
Our journey will continue into Cataclysm Classic in 2024. The Classic journey started with you as a love letter to the WoW community. We asked what you wanted, you responded to us, and we listened.
Now, what he fails to mention in this video is that the footage that he uses is actually from the WoW Classic What's Next panel, meaning that wasn't part of the opening ceremony, which was when Cataclysm Classic was actually announced. It was probably announced, I think it's like an hour before. They had the opening ceremony for about an hour, then they go into the panels after that. And I think, I could be wrong, it could be more longer, but it was at least an hour after the actual announcement of a Cataclysm Classic. So let's take a look at the difference of what happened when the Cataclysm Classic was actually announced.
And while there's still more to come in Wrath, earlier this year, we looked at your feedback to think about where are we gonna go next. We read through a lot, and I mean a lot of your feedback on social media forums, and we sent out surveys to our players. And here at BlizzCon, we're happy to announce Cataclysm is coming.
So there you have it. It's actually quite a substantial difference to the way he portrayed the actual announcement of Cataclysm Classic and the one that actually happened. And this was kind of the thing at the time. This wasn't necessarily anything new when it came to Cataclysm Classic. At the time, a lot of the community were negative towards it. maybe they had their own reasoning, but that was the sense, that was the vibe at the time, that Cataclysm Classic, it's going to die, it's going to be horrible, the whole world's on fire, literally. But I do want to mention that Nixium would go on in the rest of the video to actually make valid points about Cataclysm Classic and why he personally wasn't excited for the expansion, which obviously is 100% fair. Now, while discourse surrounding the upcoming launch of Cataclysm Classic would definitely lean to the more pessimistic side of things, there were emerging voices within the community who attempted to provide a more positive and sensible approach to the expansion. With the community finally accepting that Cataclysm Classic was coming, whether you had intentions of playing it or not, hype did start to rise for the relaunch of World of Warcraft's third expansion. And this will culminate on April 30th, 2024, when the Cataclysm Classic pre-patch launched. Now, you might have reached this point of the video and think to yourself, wow, this guy is running major defense for Cataclysm Classic. And while I personally don't think Classic deserved the hate it received up until this point, it's the pre-patch where I believe you couldn't possibly give enough hate, because the state of the pre-patch may have been the poorest state of any patch that is launched in World of Warcraft history, and yes, I'm talking about 20 plus years of history. Now, if you didn't experience it live, let's just go over some of the bugs the player base encountered on day one. When you logged on, you were greeted with some spells being completely removed, like Penance for Priests or Shield Slam for Warriors. You were unable to access some of your professions without a script, as the icons were taken up by spells that weren't even found in your spell book. Group content became problematic as you were unable to leave groups once a dungeon was done, but don't even think about exiting the game, because that would result in some of your spells or talent points completely disappearing. After all these issues, you weren't even able to vent or discuss workarounds, as guild chat didn't even work. But it didn't stop there, because we can't forget that Honor and Battlegrounds were completely disabled for majority of the day, because BGs were found to be giving an ungodly amount of XP, allowing players to level almost instantly. Now, these were some of the major bugs that players were encountering on day one, but there is something I would also like to raise, because it was, you know, another considerable thing that was missing from the pre-patch was the elemental invasions. Now, if you do remember, elemental invasions in the original Cataclysm Classic pre-patch, you know, the cool ones where you would go around fighting off invading elementals before taking on bosses from Azeroth's past for a quick way to gear up on characters before the launch. Well, yeah, forget about that. It wasn't there. Blizzard completely ignored any questions why it wasn't there, and it was just something that we just had to accept. Now, a few days would pass and majority of these issues would be resolved, but it did leave a sour taste in players' mouths, which, you know, is a byproduct of the way Blizzard and the Classic team run their show. You see, at the time of the Cataclysm Classic pre-patch, the Classic team were also juggling Classic Era, which admittedly wouldn't be as resource intensive, but on top of that, Blizzard had launched the official hardcore servers 8 months prior, and yes, only sapping a small amount of those resources, but the main culprit of the Classic team stretching themselves so thin came with a season of Discovery, which had launched their Phase 3 of content only 3 weeks prior. Now, this will be a reoccurring issue, not only in this video, but with the Classic team and all basic versions of a Classic WoW. Now, it is, to my understanding from various things that devs have said in interviews, and perhaps things I've heard, you know, from a couple of little birdies, that while the Classic team is not small, it's actually not that big either, and they tend to find themselves going all in on one version while leaving a small skeleton crew on the other versions of Classic WoW, which can kind of give that feeling of abandonment abandonment from a player's perspective, which I kind of think has happened with the Cataclysm pre-patch. They were so heavily invested into a season of discovery, and understandably so, but they were unable to dedicate the appropriate resources that the pre-patch required, and this is a reoccurring problem that you still see to this day. We're probably going to see it even more so with Blizzard, because they've added even 2 more versions of Classic in the way of Anniversary Classic Fresh and Anniversary Hardcore Fresh. Now, it's gotten so bad that the team have added a character screen drop-down menu for players to navigate between all these versions of Classic WoW, but in all honesty, that is a whole other video in itself, so let's get back on track telling the story of Cataclysm Classic. Launch day is finally here. The main servers are packed, the hype levels are high, and I must say, it went reasonably well. Considering the state of the pre-patch that launched just a few weeks prior, the launch itself went absolutely fine. Of course, some people did get hit with some connection issues. That's always going to happen with expansion launches. But overall, it was a smooth launch for players to grind their way all the way to a level 85, but none did it as fast as LMGD1. LMGD was able to pick up the world first level 85 of Cataclysm, but not without jumping over a few hurdles thanks to Blizzard. You see, LMGD came prepared for this race. He had located an area within the Twilight Highlands which had an instant respawn of mobs, and with the help of a few of his followers or friends, he was able to get all the way to level 84 before Blizzard stepped in and hotfixed the mobs he was farming to no longer give XP. He would then go to a nearby area for more hyperspawn farming, but once again Blizzard stepped in, nerfing these mobs. With being so close to level 85, LMGD would move on to his final farming spot in Deepholm, where he would achieve world first level 85 in just 3 hours after the launch of Cataclysm Classic. 10 days later, Phase 1 would truly begin. Bastion of Twilight, Blackwing Descent, and Throne of the Four Winds would all open for the player base. Now, before most average guilds would even be able to venture into the raids, the race to World First was already underway, with EU Guild Progress from Genhaeus achieving World First 25-man heroic clear for all Phase 1 content. The remaining guilds and less hardcore players would eventually start their raiding journey with nearly 210,000 characters raiding in the first lockout of Phase 1, with these numbers continuing to climb throughout the phase, with raiding numbers hitting its peak at 317,328 characters, which would also be the peak for the entirety of Cataclysm Classic. In a peculiar twist and perhaps a further demonstration of how many resources were dedicated to Cataclysm Classic during this time, Blizzard announced 2 dedicated esports events for Cataclysm Classic: the Dragon Slayer Challenge and the Cataclysm Arena Tournament. The Dragon Slayer Challenge would see the 2 top guilds in progress and none of the above all start at level 1 and race through all the 3 latest Cataclysm Classic raids over a 2-day period. The Dragon Slayer Challenge took place on the weekend of June 8th and would see none of the above or Nota, the eventual winner of the race, and actually managed to take home a prize pool of $50,000. The following weekend, the Cataclysm Arena Tournament took place, and it came as to no surprise at all when Team Liquid took first place in the NA region, while the Workshop claimed first place in EU. Both teams shared in the $50,000 prize pool. With both esport events wrapping up, this would sadly mark the first and last time Cataclysm Classic held any type of Blizzard esport event.
I think they just go on Asmo actually and CC the Warrior. That's exactly what they're gonna do. There's the Nova, there's the Deep Freeze, big damage, beautiful disarm, beautiful charge, and dude trying to do what he can for Asmo, but there's the DR Kidney, and I think the workshop has done it.
A month or so after the esport events, Phase 2 would launch in Cataclysm Classic, Rise of the Zandalari. Now Phase 2 would offer little in terms of content except for 2 new dungeons, Zul Aman and Zul Gorab. This would understandably take a hit on participation and rating numbers, as the height of Phase 2 would see 211,839 characters rating in a singular lockout. This would be down over 100,000 characters compared to the previous Phase 1 height of over 300,000 players, which obviously, as previous stated, would act as the height of Cataclysm Classic through its entire lifespan.
Fall to your knees, mortals. Sulfuras, be your end.
Players would have to wait a further 3 months before they saw any type of new content, which came in the form of Phase 3 Rage of the Firelands. This would see the Molten Front questing area, the fondly remembered Firelands raid, and the highly demanded Elemental Rune dungeons. Now, these rune dungeons were first teased at the announcement of Cataclysm Classic and would act as a heroic plus, similar to what we saw during Wrath of the Lich King Classic and the Alpha, Beta, and Gamma dungeons. The player base were calling for these since Phase 1 of Cataclassic, as they offered an alternative way to obtain raid loot. But unfortunately, these requests fell on deaf ears, with many players thinking they left it far too late, particularly considering the lull period players endured throughout Phase 2. A week would pass after the launch of Phase 3 and the gates of the Firelands would open, with guilds vying for a world first clear. EU supremacy would continue in the form of Gehenna's guild Newman, who picked up world first heroic Firelands, which was completed in just under an hour. Now, in terms of rating numbers, these would follow a similar trend from Phase 2 and unfortunately further slip, as the height of Phase 3 would reach 132,141 characters, which would be a 79,000 character dip from the previous phase. Now, this 130,000 number would remain the core rating numbers for the remainder of Cataclysm Classic. 3 months would pass and Phase 4 would launch and unironically bring the most content to players compared to previous phases. Phase 4, Hour of Twilight, would have players tackle 3 new dungeons in Well of Eternity, Hour of Twilight, and End Time. This would be alongside Twilight Protocol dungeons, which was the next step from Phase 3's Elemental Rune, and obviously the controversial Dragonsoul raid. Just 2 days later, after the initial release of Phase 4, that decisive raid, Dragonsoul, would release, and with that came Cataclysm Classic's final race to world first. The EU dominance would continue and close out the final raid tier of Cataclassic, with Newman taking out a world first Dragonsoul in a run that only took them a little bit over an hour to complete.
Let's fucking go! Let's fucking go! Let's fucking go!
Oh my god.
There's no way, man.
Now, in relation to participation or rating numbers, 123,989 characters would enter Dragonsoul for the first week and would act as the height for Phase 4. This means that Cataclysm Classic was able to hold on to the majority of their raiding population with only a drop of around about 8,000 characters when comparing it to last phase peak. Now, with the weeks that would have followed, understandably so, the raiding of population would start to take a dip or start to drop off. Now, if you have a look at previous phases or even expansions, this isn't anything new. At the end of the day, there still remains a dedicated and, dare I say, impressive community are still playing Cataclysm Classic. But with Mists of Pandaria launching very soon, it will be interesting to see what kind of influx of players comes to Cata, or soon to be MOP, but only a time will tell. And with that, this kind of marks the end of my Cataclysm Classic retrospective. Was it a success? Personally, I think it was, particularly when you look at the community sentiment prior to its release. But unfortunately, it did suffer that long-term Blizzard trend of immediate relative success, but it suffers over its lifespan due to poor management and a lack of a dedicated resources. Nonetheless, I did enjoy my limited time with Cataclysm Classic, but I am keen to hear your thoughts. Did you enjoy Cata, or was it a failure in your eyes? Let me know, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.